Hey guys! Tonight we wander into one of those historical rabbit holes that makes you squint at your globe and wonder if you've been lied to your entire life. Picture this: vast golden domes catching the morning sun, streets paved in marble so polished you can see your reflection, and towers that rise so high they practically wink at the stars. This is Tartaria, or rather, this is the Tartaria you're about to dream your way through. You probably won't survive this. At least not with your current understanding of history intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what you hear. And hey, while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing the little map we all draw together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You close your eyes and begin walking down a road that seems to stretch forever. Somewhere between the wind-swept steppes of Mongolia and the endless tundra of Siberia. The air is crisp, and there's that faint smell of wood smoke clinging to your jacket, like a reminder that civilization isn't too far away. But here's the twist: you're not heading toward a lonely outpost or a huddle of yurts. Instead, you see a glittering skyline breaking the horizon, spires and domes that shouldn't be here. You're looking at the lost cities of Tartaria. Historians will tell you that Tartaria wasn't real, just a cartographer's convenience, a way of labeling a vaguely understood region of northern Asia. But the more you listen to whispered legends, the more it feels like there's something waiting under the dust. You picture yourself walking past walls carved with spirals, arches so mathematically precise that even our modern tools would sweat trying to replicate them. That's when it hits you: if this place ever existed, it wasn't just another nomadic kingdom. It was advanced, possibly even beyond what we've achieved today. A horse snorts nearby, and you notice riders moving through the streets. But they aren't your Hollywood steppe warriors with fur caps and shaggy ponies. They look regal, armored with strange alloys that catch the light like liquid silver. Some French researchers claim that Tartarians mastered metallurgy in ways we still don't understand, like Damascus steel. But dialed up to 11. Mainstream scholars laugh it off. Of course, saying there's no evidence, but you catch yourself thinking, if cities can be buried by mud, maybe evidence can too. You pass under a colossal archway, and your ears buzz faintly. Is it just the wind? Or something else? Rumors suggest Tartaria might have known how to harness natural energies, the Earth's own magnetic fields. Perhaps, through architecture itself. It's hard not to chuckle at the idea of Wi-Fi powered by onion domes. But then again, wireless electricity was Nikola Tesla's dream, and he wasn't exactly peddling fairy tales. You keep walking, one eyebrow raised, half expecting your phone to start charging in your pocket. Every corner you turn a dead end to the unease. Streets are too wide, plazas too orderly. There's a sense of planning here, as if the city grew from a single, unified vision. And that's another oddity. Historians still argue whether nomadic cultures of Central Asia could have produced urban planning on this scale. The debate usually ends with a polite shrug and a pivot back to Roche's expansionist narratives. But when you're standing here, boots scuffing on polished stone, it's hard not to imagine a civilization with blueprints and grand ambitions. Then there's the quiet. For all its grandeur, the city feels hushed, like a stage after the actors have left. Maybe that's the scariest part. You sense that someone wanted this silence. You remember how often history is written by victors, and how often victors conveniently forget to mention their rivals. Think about it: if Tartaria had been vast and powerful, stretching across Asia, swallowing half the map, wouldn't it make sense that later empires wanted that memory erased? That the erasure itself might be the biggest clue? The breeze carries a dry taste of dust now. The kind that sneaks into your throat and makes you cough. You wipe your lips and realize the marble beneath your feet isn't so perfect anymore. Cracks spiderweb across the pavement. Here and there, chunks of stone have collapsed inward, like the earth itself swallowed pieces of the city. Theories about cataclysmic floods, so-called mud floods, begin whispering in your mind. Imagine waking up one morning to find your street half buried, your front door now a basement window. You shiver at the thought. Though part of you wants to laugh. If history has taught us anything, it's that nature doesn't care about property value. And yet, even as the stones crumble and the silence deepens, the skyline still glitters. The golden domes reflect a light that doesn't seem to fade, as if Tartaria is trying, just barely, to remind you it once existed. You tilt your head back, letting your eyes trace the towers until your neck aches. For a fleeting second, you wonder whether some of the skyscrapers in your own city carry echoes of this forgotten design. Maybe that's why we build them, to imitate ghosts we don't admit we've seen. The ground trembles faintly beneath your boots. A reminder that dreams like this don't last forever. Still, you take another step forward, knowing the real unraveling is yet to come. You keep walking, and the streets thin out into fields that roll like an endless sea of grass. The wind whistles sharp against your ears, carrying with it a smell both earthy and metallic, as though iron itself were hiding in the soil. Ahead, scattered across the ground, you spot something far stranger than golden domes, maps. Yes, actual maps, giant sheets of parchment pinned into the grass as though some cosmic cartographer grew careless and dropped their work across the steppe. You kneel to look closer, tracing faded lines that snake across Asia. And there it is again, the word, Tartaria. Sometimes bold and proud, stretching across half the continent. Other times scribbled vaguely, like an afterthought between Siberia and China. You can't help but smirk. Apparently even in the past, people weren't great at agreeing on directions. Mainstream history tells you that early European cartographers often used the label, Tartary, as a catch-all for lands they didn't fully understand. It was a shorthand for, here be people we don't really know about. And yet, the sheer scale of it on these old maps makes you pause. We're not talking about a sliver of territory, but an empire drawn so massive it dwarfed entire countries you actually recognize. Historians still argue whether this was just ignorance or whether something substantial lay behind the ink. Your fingers brush over the paper, and the texture is rough, brittle. A gust of wind flips one corner upward, revealing a sketch of a fortress that looks suspiciously advanced for the supposed time period. High walls with geometric designs, towers angled like antennas, and in the corner, a note scrawled in Latin, something you can't fully read but that feels urgent. Like a warning or a secret. You chuckle softly. Who knew maps could gossip? You roll another map open. And this one features sea monsters riding in the oceans. Their mouths wide and absurd. Sailors of the 16th century loved doodling like that. Partly out of fear, partly out of boredom. And then you remember, the idea of monsters at the edge of the world wasn't just superstition. It was often a way to keep people from exploring further. What if labeling vast swaths of Asia as Tartary wasn't laziness, but deliberate fog, a curtain to hide whatever was really there? As you stand, the parchment crinkles underfoot, sounding almost like bones. You glance up and notice a stone marker in the distance. A slab jutting out from the ground at an angle. Its surface is carved with lupine symbols. Spirals within spirals, a language you don't recognize. It looks eerily similar to designs you've seen in ancient Celtic ruins. Though you're halfway across the world. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the same story was whispered in different tongues. French researchers love to point out how cartographers occasionally placed cities in the middle of Siberia, cities that supposedly don't exist. Take the example of Cathay, often blended with or next to Tartary. A ghost kingdom straddling the known and the unknown. Some of those maps even suggest bustling trade routes. Yet modern archaeology finds nothing. Which leads to two options. Either the cartographers were overly imaginative, or someone's been very thorough about cleaning up. You tilt your head, wondering which sounds more suspicious. Another gust of wind slaps at your coat, tugging a corner of one map high into the air. You chase it, feeling faintly ridiculous, as if the parchment itself is leading you somewhere. It tumbles toward a ridge, catching briefly on a thorn bush. And when you finally grab it, your breath catches, because below that ridge, stretching in a shallow valley, are faint outlines, stone foundations forming grids, streets, maybe even plazas. The maps weren't exaggerating. The valley is half buried. The ground lumpy and uneven, like a quilt stitched over ruins. You pick your way down, heart thudding faster. Each step echoes with the absurdity of it, standing in a plaza that shouldn't exist. Guided by a scrap of forgotten cartography, you squat near one foundation stone and press your palm against its surface. Cold, too cold for the mild air around you. The stone almost ooms under your touch, like it remembers something. You have joked to yourself. Well, if my hand starts glowing, at least I'll make the news. Above, the wind has quieted, almost as if it, too, is waiting for you to notice the patterns etched faintly into the stone. Spirals again, concentric circles, Lines that mimic magnetic fields drawn in old physics textbooks. Tesla would have lost his mind here. And you start to wonder, what if the maps weren't lies? What if they were breadcrumbs leading to a story that was just too inconvenient for later generations to keep alive? The evening sky slides from pale blue to violet, stars sharpening one by one. You look back at the scattered maps glowing faintly in the twilight. They're not just relics, they're invitations. Invitations to imagine a world where Tartaria wasn't a footnote, but a chapter ripped out of the book. And as you fold the parchment carefully under your arm, you realize you're not just following roads anymore. You're following secrets. The valley falls away behind you, and now the dream carries you forward into the heart of a city that feels both ancient and futuristic at once. Your boots tap across cobblestones so smooth they look freshly laid, yet their edges glow faintly as if charged with some invisible energy. Steam rises from vents at the corners of streets, curling in lacy ribbons that catch the moonlight. You pause, half expecting a tram to screech past. But the tracks here aren't iron, they're something darker, stranger, humming with a vibration that tickles your bones. You glance around at the buildings. Their foundations are carved from stone older than empires. Yet their roofs glisten with metallic panels angled toward the sky. They look suspiciously like solar arrays. Thought that would be absurd. You can't help but chuckle, if Tartaria really had green energy. Someone should have left us the instruction manual. Still, it's hard to ignore the symmetry, spiraling motifs etched into columns. Archways shaped like tuning forks. Whole plazas laid out as if designed to channel sound or light. Historians still argue whether early civilizations truly aligned their cities with the stars on purpose. Or whether we're just seeing patterns where none exist. But standing here, it doesn't feel accidental. The air tastes faintly metallic. And there's a buzzing just on the edge of her ring. It reminds you of standing too close to a power line. Or maybe inside an old CRT television, you know. The kind that gave you a shock if you touched the glass. You run your hand along a wall and it's warm. Almost alive. Maybe this is what people mean when they whisper about architecture that was more than just shelter, that these structures were machines in disguise. You can almost imagine ancient engineers plugging their inventions straight into the city itself. Like charging ports hidden in the bricks. You pass under a vaulted arch. And there's the faint hiss of water. A canal splits the city. But it's no muddy ditch. The water here glows faintly blue, lit from beneath by channels of glass. You bend low, dipping your fingers in, and the liquid is surprisingly warm. Humming like it's alive. Ancient aqueducts in Rome carried water for baths and fountains. True, but this feels different, as if the water itself is being coaxed into doing work. Fringe theorists sometimes claim that civilizations used living water as a kind of energy system, structured at a molecular level. Mainstream academics shake their heads, rolling their eyes. But you can't deny how the idea lingers when you see this glow running like veins through the city. A cart rolls past, wheels silent on the glowing stones. But instead of a horse pulling it, the vehicle moves on its own, humming faintly. Your jaw slackens. An ancient self-driving car? That feels impossible. Yet here it is, drifting smoothly like it knows exactly where to go. For a moment, you consider hopping on. Then again, climbing into a mystery ride in a half-real city is exactly how horror movies start. Better to watch from a safe distance. A tower looms ahead, its base square, its top flaring out into delicate spires. You crane your neck and notice how the spires don't just decorate the skyline, they align perfectly with constellations overhead. Orion's belt glimmers, mirrored by 3 silver points on the tower. Historians still debate whether such alignments were intentional or simply coincidence. But coincidence doesn't usually like a tuning fork in your chest. You wander closer, and at the base of the tower is a panel covered in spirals and triangular grooves. Without thinking, you place your palm against it. The grooves glow faintly, tracing out patterns beneath your skin. For a moment, you feel like you're being scanned, like the city itself is testing you. Measuring whether you belong. You laugh nervously. Yeah, sure, no pressure. Just proving my worth to a dead empire. The glow fades, and the panel releases a puff of steam, as though exhaling in disappointment. You step back, heart thumping, realizing this place isn't just ruins, it's interactive. You half expect a city-like voice to start giving you directions in an ancient tongue. Maybe that's the real secret. Tartaria didn't just build monuments. They built systems, machines hidden inside marble and stone. And once you start thinking that way, the whole city begins to shift in your imagination. A fountain nearby erupts in a spray of water, lit by flickering sparks like fireflies. Children laugh somewhere, faint, ghostly echoes, but when you glance over, the square is empty. You swallow hard. Cities don't just vanish, their people leave traces. If Tartaria was ever this advanced, where did everyone go? Catastrophe, assimilation, or maybe something stranger, something that made the world decide to erase their existence altogether. You keep moving, thoughts slower now, feet dragging as if reluctant to disturb the hush. You glance back once, catching the steam, the glowing water, the tower humming under starlight. And even though you know you're dreaming, part of you wants to believe that somewhere, buried under mud and maps, the bones of this city are still waiting. Your steps take you down a narrow alley, the kind that squeezes the air out of your chest. The cobblestones slope sharply, as if the whole street is leaning into the earth itself. At first you assume it's just old age, the slow settling of stone over centuries. But then you notice the doors. Every house you pass has its main door sunken below ground level. Windows hover where doors should be. Some buildings seem buried up to their second story, only the rooftops peeking proudly into the open air. You frown. This isn't just bad architecture. It looks as if the entire city has been swallowed. You crouch beside one half-buried archway and brush the dirt with your hand. The soil crumbles easily, too loose for natural accumulation. It feels dumped, not formed. Your fingers trace the outline of a decorative lintel now hidden below street level, carved with spirals and sunburst. That door once stood proudly at eye height. Not like this, cowering underground. You swallow, and suddenly the air smells damp, heavy with mildew. This is where whispers of the Great Mud Flood echo. Fringe theorists insist that in the 18 or 19 century, a global disaster rolled across continents, smothering cities in mud and sediment overnight. Mainstream historians dismiss it as nonsense, pointing to poor record keeping, changing street levels, or simply rebuilding over time. Still, you can't shake the image, a whole civilization waking one morning to find half its buildings suffocated by earth. You shuffle forward, boots scraping over stone, and imagine the panic. Doors barricaded by soil, families digging windows into walls to climb out, whole plazas drowning in silence. The idea is terrifying, yet oddly magnetic. You joke under your breath. At least property taxes would have gone down, basements suddenly included. But the humor falls flat in the heavy air. Ahead, you find a plaza where the ground has slumped into a sinkhole. What should be a flat square is instead a crater. Walls of dirt exposing entire hidden stories of buildings. Stone archways gape like mouths. Stairs lead downward into dark soil. You edge closer, feeling both thrilled and unnerved. Were these basements, or once street-level homes, swallowed in a single sweep? The wind carries a low moan. Though you know it's just air whistling through the hollow structures. Still, goosebumps crawl up your arms. You picture carts overturned, children scrambling for high ground, and silence falling as the city disappeared beneath sludge. Historians still argue whether floods or earthquakes could have caused widespread burying across Eurasia. But the scale described in mud flood lore feels unnatural, cataclysmic. You notice something glimmering in the soil wall. A shard of glass, no bigger than your palm, wedged in the dirt. You pry it free, wiping mud from its surface, and realize it's not ordinary glass. It bends faintly in your grip. Resilient, almost like plastic. You blink. Modern glass cracks easily, yet here's something older, stranger. Thor. You chuckle softly. Imagine dropping your phone and not shattering it. Guess Tartarians had that figured out. Sliding the shard into your pocket, you wander deeper into the plaza. The structures half buried around you look eerily familiar, arches like Roman aqueducts, domes like Byzantine churches, buttresses that could belong in a Gothic cathedral. It's a mashup of styles. Like history's greatest hits all performed at once. Was Tartaria borrowing from the world? Or was the world borrowing from Tartaria? That's the question no textbook wants you to ask. A memory stirs of other cities with lower levels, mysteriously hidden beneath modern streets. Edinburgh has its buried vaults. Seattle famously raised its roads, leaving a ghost town beneath. But here, the scale feels larger, the intent less planned. The mud flood ideal lingers, not just a local oddity, but something continental, maybe even global. You step carefully toward one exposed stairwell. The air down there is cold, damp, almost metallic. You hesitate at the edge, half expecting a hand to reach out from the shadows. Nothing. Just the whisper of history. You exhale and step back. The dream may be vivid, but you don't need horror movie levels of bravery tonight. As you leave the plaza, you glance back once more at the buried doors. The sunken arches, the glimmering shard still warm in your pocket. If this really happened, if an entire layer of civilization was literally buried alive, then maybe history isn't wrong. Maybe it's incomplete. The city exhales around you, dust rising faintly as if remembering its own burial. You keep walking, boots crunching over ground that feels less like earth and more like secrets. Packed down for centuries, waiting for someone curious, or foolish, enough to notice. The alley opens into a windswept plain, and suddenly the air feels heavier, almost expectant. The horizon ripples, and from it emerge shapes that make your stomach flip, figures taller than any you've ever seen. Their heads crest well above the average crowd, shoulders broad enough to block out chunks of sky. At first, you think your perspective is playing tricks, but as they draw closer, you realize, no, these people are giants. Legends of Tartarian giants pop up like weeds in half-forgotten texts and folklore. Soldiers taller than doors, rulers who dwarfed their thrones, bones allegedly dug up in remote valleys only to vanish from museums. Mainstream historians call these tales exaggerations, myths born of imagination and AWE. And yet, staring up at a warrior whose belt sits at your eye level, you can't help muttering, either the diet here was incredible, or someone really stretched the truth. The giant nearest you carries a spear. Though calling it a spear feels insulting, it's more like a lamp post tipped with steel. His armor gleams faintly, made not of iron plates but overlapping scales that look organic, almost like polished bone. As he walks, the ground gives a soft tremor under each step. You glance down at your boots, half expecting them to vibrate like they do in the subway when a train barrels past. You follow at a safe distance, nerves prickling, and notice how the crowd parts for them with a mixture of reverence and fear. Children stare wide-eyed, while merchants bow stiffly, their goods rattling on wooden carts. The giants don't seem cruel, but they carry an air of inevitability, like storm clouds rolling across the plains. If these beings once ruled Tartaria, you start to understand why empires might have wanted their memory erased. Who would want to admit they were overshadowed, light rally, by rivals three heads taller? There's a story you once read, tucked into the footnotes of a history book, about Peter the Great of Russia. He was said to be unusually tall for his time, around 6'7". Impressive, sure, but not quite giant. Still, fringe theorists sometimes point to him as proof of a lineage, an edge of Tartarian blood diluted through generations. Historians still argue whether Peter's height was extraordinary genetics or just a freak accident of biology. But standing here among these towering figures, Peter suddenly seems like the runt of the litter. You chuckle quietly, imagining modern basketball scouts salivating at the thought. Forget the NBA draft, just resurrect Tartaria and sign a whole team. But the humor fades quickly when one of the giants turns his gaze toward you. His eyes are pale, almost translucent, like chips of cloudy quartz. They fix on you not with malice, but with a slow, unsettling curiosity. You freeze, feeling suddenly very small, which, let's be honest, you are. The giant raises a hand, not in threat but in greeting. His palm is broad enough that you could probably lie down across it like a mattress. You hesitate, then lift your own hand in a tiny wave. The corners of his mouth twitch upward, the ghost of a smile, before he continues on his way. The crowd resumes its rhythm, but you're left standing, heart pounding, wondering what just happened. Did you just say hello to proof of a forgotten species? Or was that simply your dream layering myth over imagination? You wander further into the plain, noticing the remnants of colossal structures that seem scaled for these giants. Doorways 10 feet tall, stairs with risers so high you'd need a ladder just to climb one step. Suddenly, the mud-flood buried arches from earlier make more sense. Maybe they weren't buried at all. Maybe they were just built for bigger occupants. You exhale sharply, the thought rattling you more than you expect. Near the edge of the ruins, you stumble upon something even stranger, a colossal femur bone, half buried in the dirt. It's weathered, cracked, but unmistakably human-shaped, and far larger than any skeleton you've ever seen. You crouch beside it, running your hand along the rough surface, and mutter, well, that's not going to fit in a museum display case. Fringe reports have long claimed that giant bones were discovered in North America and Siberia, only to be quietly misplaced by institutions. Conspiracy, mistake, or quiet cover-up? Scholars still debate, though the debates rarely make it to your high school textbooks. The wind whistles louder now, rushing across the plains, carrying dust and whispers. You look up at the departing figures, silhouettes etched against a crimson sunset, tear fading into the horizon. One long stride at a time. You know you'll never catch them, but part of you doesn't need to. Just seeing them was enough. Enough to crack open your certainty and leave a question that won't stop echoing. If giants once walked among us, what else has been edited out of the story? The plain dissolves behind you, and now you're winding your way into the heart of a great city again. But this one feels different. You notice immediately how the skyline bristles with towers, tall, elegant spires tapering into the sky, each crowned with strange metal orbs. They shimmer faintly in the dusk, as if dragging down starlight. You stop, neck craned, squinting. These aren't churches, not entirely, tear machines pretending to be monuments. You wander into a square where the largest of these towers dominates the view. Its base is solid stone, etched with the familiar spirals and geometric grooves you've been seeing everywhere. But as your eyes travel upward, the material changes: copper plates, lattices of fine metal rods, and finally a bulby-shaped dome gleaming like polished brass. The whole thing hums softly, the same way power lines do if you stand close on a humid day. Whispers of Tartaria often return to these towers, so-called antennae, hidden in plain sight. Some theorists suggest they were power transmitters, drawing energy from the atmosphere itself, much like Tesla's grand but unrealized dream of wireless electricity. Mainstream historians, of course, insist they're simply decorative spires, architectural flourishes common in Orthodox churches or civic buildings. Historians still argue whether such structures had any practical use beyond aesthetics. But here, standing in the glow of humming metal, it's hard not to feel that the towers are awake. A chill dances along your arm, hairs rising as if charged with static. You glance down at your phone, which has been long dead in this dream world. For the first time, the screen flickers faintly, a ghostly light blooming before fading. Your heart leaps. Then you laugh. Great. Tartarian wireless charging. Beats fighting over outlets at the airport. The plaza around you seems designed to fit into the tower. Wide avenues funnel inward, their cobblestones forming deliberate patterns, spirals, radiating lines, even fractal-like designs that resemble crop circles. It's as if the entire city were an antenna, and the tower simply focused the flow. You shuffle your boots along one of the lines and swear you feel a vibration through the soles. Like standing on a bass speaker during a concert. You find a smaller tower tucked at the edge of the square. This one is broken at the top. Its brass orb shattered, jagged edges glittering faintly in the fading light. Approaching it, you run your hand along the copper plates. Tear warm, unnervingly warm. As though still conducting something. You snatch your hand back, muttering under your breath, "Okay, that's fine. I didn't need fingerprints anyway." From the shadows of the plaza, a faint light pulses. You follow it, weaving between silent colonnades, until you find a set of children's toys scattered near the base of another tower. Simple things, wooden blocks. A carved horse, but oddly magnetized. When you move one block, the others twitch and shift as though tugged by unseen strings. You tilt your head, unsettled. Imagine growing up in a city where even your toys were affected by the infrastructure. No wonder legends cling to this place. There's a memory buried in your head of the world's fairs. Those massive expositions of the 19th century. They displayed entire palaces and domes with ornate spires that looked suspiciously like these towers. Some theorists argue that the fairs weren't temporary at all, but Tartarian relics rebranded as exhibitions before being torn down. Mainstream scholars dismiss this as fantasy, pointing to the meticulous construction records and photographs. Still, the resemblance is hard to ignore. You murmur to yourself, maybe we weren't building replicas, maybe we were showing off someone else's leftovers. The air grows heavier the longer you linger. Your ears buzz faintly, like when you're too close to a speaker. You stumble back toward the main plaza, eyes watering. The central tower looms, its brass orb glowing faintly as if answering your presence. It doesn't feel hostile, but it does feel aware. You half expect a beam of light to lance downward, scanning you the way the panel in the earlier section did. You back away, steadying your breath. and glance around at the silent city. The towers stand sentinel, humming softly, radiating their mystery, and in that you feel a strange comfort, like maybe Tartaria wasn't just advanced, but generous. Maybe they wanted energy to flow freely, shared across cities, unmetered and untaxed. The thought makes you laugh softly. Free Wi-Fi and free power? No wonder someone buried them. The laugh dies quickly, though, leaving you with the in your bones and the uneasy suspicion that you're trespassing in a world that once knew how to do everything we only dream about. You drift away from the humming towers. Your steps lighter now, as though the ground itself has grown less solid. The streets narrow, curling like vines until you find yourself standing before a wall. Not just any wall, though, its entire surface is covered in spirals. Spirals within spirals, loops nesting like shells, symbols that seem to repeat infinitely if you stare long enough. At first, you assume it's just decoration. Ancient artisans love patterns, after all, but the longer you stare, the more the spirals seem to pulse, as though shifting subtly each time you blink. You reach out, fingertips grazing the grooves. The stone is cool, almost sleek, like polished bone, and as your hand moves along the pattern, your lips begin to form sounds you don't recognize. A language, maybe, though not one you've ever studied. French researchers often point to the sophist, Tartarian script, strange looping letters that appeared on maps and documents centuries ago. Some claim it was its own language, others dismiss it as artistic flair or mistakes by European cartographers. Historians still argue whether Tartaria ever had a written tradition at all, or whether it's entirely imagined. Yet here, in this dream, the spirals feel alive, like a grammar of symbols waiting for you to notice. You step back to take in the wall fully. The spirals aren't random, they form a massive fractal, repeating shapes that shrink smaller and smaller the closer you look. Like the Mandelbrot set, but chiseled in stone long before computers. Your mind touches trying to process it. You mutter softly, either this was art, or somebody really wanted to hide equations where only daydreamers would find them. A breeze stirs, and loose sand skitters across the ground, hissing faintly as it slides into the grooves. The spirals drink it in, making the pattern glow faintly in the moonlight. You watch in AW as lines you hadn't noticed before emerge, connecting symbols like a circuit board. Suddenly it doesn't look like language or art, it looks like a diagram. Maybe instructions, maybe even a machine disguised as a mural. You press your ear against the stone, half hawking, expecting whispers. To your surprise, there's a faint steady and low, like a tuning fork vibrating deep within. Your heart skips. This isn't just symbolic, it's functional. You laugh nervously. Great, I've just unlocked Tartarian Rosetta Stone meets Alexa. And then you notice something else. Across the plaza, another wall bears similar carvings, but in a completely different style. Where this one loops endlessly, the other uses sharp angles, like lightning bolts stitched together. You walk over, tracing their edges. They remind you of runes from Northern Europe, or even early Chinese script. The thought hits hard. What if Tartaria wasn't isolated, but connected? A crossroads that absorbed script, symbols, and motifs from everywhere, and reworked them into something new? The debate about language origins often splits scholars. Did writing emerge in multiple places independently, or spread from a single source? Historians still argue whether shared motifs across continents are coincidence or proof of some hidden web. Standing here, with spirals on one side and runes on the other, it's hard not to imagine Tartaria as the missing link. A flicker of light draws your attention downward. On the ground, between the two walls, the patterns converge. Spirals morph into angles, forming a hybrid script under your feet. It glows faintly, pulsing in rhythm with your heartbeat. For a terrifying moment, you wonder if it's reacting to you, measuring you the way the tower once did. You whisper, "Okay, chill, I don't need a magical literacy test tonight." The glow fades slowly, leaving only the carvings. But your pulse doesn't calm so easily. You realize you've stumbled into more than ruins. You walked into a library. A library that doesn't use books, but walls, streets, entire cities as itself. A place where knowledge is encoded in the very stone you walk on. As you back away, the patterns blur in your vision, like they don't want to be remembered too clearly. You rub your eyes, dizzy, half afraid you'll wake up and lose it all. But for now, the spirals and runes linger, whispering their strange grammar of loops and lightning. A language not lost, but waiting. Your footsteps echo as you leave the spiraled walls behind. And the echo doesn't quite sound like stone on stone. It's softer, almost metallic, as though the ground itself is a sheet of something manufactured rather than natural rock. You glance down. The surface glimmers faintly, not like dust but like tiny glass grains fused together. You kneel, scoop a handful, and let it slide through your fingers. It doesn't crumble, it sings. The handful of sand makes a faint chime as it trickles back onto the ground. Like wind bells caught in your palm. You freeze, startled. Glass that sings. It reminds you of the old stories about Roman, flexible glass. The fabled material that could bend without breaking. Historians still argue whether it was real or just another dinner party legend. But here in Tartaria's dreamscape, you're standing ankle deep in it. You walk farther, and suddenly the walls open into what looks like a market. Or, at least, the ghost of one. Stone stalls stand empty, their counters smooth from centuries of touch. Wooden frames, petrified with time, lean at angles but still hold together better than modern IKEA furniture. You imagine bustling crowds, voices shouting in languages now forgotten, traders laying out words that seem impossible even by today's standards. On one counter, something shimmers. A bolt of fabric lies there, impossibly preserved. You brush it with your hand, it's light as mist. Yet when you tug, it resists like braided steel. You laugh under your breath. Move over. Kevlar. Tartaria beat you to it. Fringe theorists love to imagine Tartarian tech disguised as ordinary trade goods, glass stronger than steel, fabrics lighter than air, tools that never rust. You recall one bizarre tidbit. 19th century explorers supposedly brought back knives that could cut stone but dulled on bread. Probably nonsense, but here, with that strange cloth between your fingers, nonsense suddenly feels reasonable. You picture caravans stretching across the steppes, packed with crates of these wonders. Silk from China, spices from India. Sure, but what if Tartaria added its own treasures? Maybe the world fairs of Europe, with their dazzling pavilions, weren't just about national pride. Maybe they were clearance sales for Tartaria's leftovers. As you wander deeper, more relics appear. A goblet that seems carved from diamond but feels like wood. A shard of mirror that reflects you. Almost. The face staring back is yours. But older, with eyes glowing faintly, as though the mirror is showing the version of you who has read every spiral wall and understood every rune. You blink, and it's gone. Just a shard of broken glass once more. The air smells faintly metallic. Like ozone before a storm. A breeze steers through the stalls. And for a second the fabric shifts. Not like cloth but like liquid light. Pulling in folds then snapping back into shape. You feel your skin prickle. If Tartaria had markets, they weren't just selling bread and onions, they were showing off reality-bending souvenirs. You catch yourself grinning. Yeah, sure, I'll take 2 goblets that warp my reflection. A roll of dragon scale cloth. And, oh, why not? A brick of singing glass for the kids. It's a ridiculous thought, but that's how markets work. Wonders become casual when you see them every day. And yet, you wonder, why didn't the rest of the world preserve these marvels? Why are there no museums filled with Tartarian cloth or Tartarian glass? Historians still argue whether such artifacts ever existed. But if they did, they either vanished in disasters, were hoarded in private collections, or worse, were deliberately erased. After all, nothing rewrites history faster than hiding evidence. The stalls grow quieter the farther you walk, until the counters hold only dust. Still, the atmosphere lingers, the sense that you walked through a shopping street where impossible goods on sale lay stacked in plain sight. The kind of goods that would make empires nervous. Because how do you conquer a people whose fabric can stop your arrows? Whose glass can bend into bridges? Whose markets sell reflections of futures that never arrive? You pause at the end of the street, looking back once more. The bolts of cloth ripple faintly in the moonlight, as though someone invisible has just brushed past, haggling in a language of spirals. You shiver. The market may be empty, but the trade of wonders never really ended. It just slipped sideways, into legend. You step beyond the market stalls, and the of imagined commerce fades into something colder, sharper, the weight of politics pressing down. You're no longer wandering among trinkets but drifting closer to palaces and thrones. Tartaria's story, if it ever existed, wouldn't just be about fabrics and singing glass. It would be about power. And in this part of the dream, shadows of TSARs and cans seem to loom everywhere. You picture an enormous throne room. The ceiling arches high, carved not with the gilded flourishes of Versailles, but with stark geometries, spirals, interlocking triangles, symbols that seem designed to whisper, "We built this with math you don't understand." At the center sits a ruler, a giant of a man, or perhaps a woman, robed in something that flickers between fur, silk, and that impossible Tartarian fabric you saw in the market. Historians still argue whether Tartaria, if it was real, was a kingdom, a confederation, or even a vast empire sprawling from Siberia to Central Asia. Mainstream accounts of Russian history mention the Tartars mostly as steppe raiders, opponents of Moscow's rise, or footnotes in the sweep of the Mongol invasions. But fringe tales paint them differently, not ragtag horsemen, but an advanced society whose collapse cleared the way for the Tsar's rise. You can almost hear a political strategist of the day whispering, "Erase the empire. Steal the crown." If Tartaria had its own monarchs, how threatening would they have been to Moscow? Imagine a rival capital in the east, dazzling with technology and culture. Would the Romanovs tolerate it? Probably not. Rulers tend to prefer being the only ones with palaces big enough to make guests feel tiny. You chuckle to yourself, imagine an awkward diplomatic dinner, "Welcome to Moscow. Yes, lovely throne you've got there. Ours runs on free wireless power. No big deal." Yeah, that wouldn't go over well. The shadows of history twist here. You think of Catherine the Great, the empress who expanded Russia's territories so dramatically in the 18th century. Mainstream history says she pushed against the Ottomans, swallowed chunks of Poland, secured the Black Sea, but fringe theorists sometimes ask, was she also sweeping up the last embers of Tartaria? Did the Romanovs' maps grow bigger not only because of conquest, but because of annexation of lands that had just been vacated? Then there's Peter the Great, the Tsar who dragged Russia into the modern age. Or so the textbooks say. He built St. Petersburg, shaved the boyars' beards, imported shipbuilders and scientists from Europe. But what if he didn't import as much as we think? What if he borrowed Tartarian knowledge already sitting in the East? You picture Peter sneaking through dusty Tartarian vaults, smirking like a kid caught with someone else's homework. And in that moment, the idea doesn't feel absurd, because St. Petersburg itself, those massive stone facades, endless columns, and symmetrical designs, still feels strangely out of place for the time it was built. Mainstream scholars explain it as borrowing from European neoclassicism. Fringe whispers call it stolen Tartarian architecture, recycled and passed off as Russian innovation. The throne room you imagine darkens, torches flickering along its walls. The ruler on the throne rises, impossibly tall. Their shadow falls across maps etched into the floor, lines stretching over Asia and bleeding into Europe. And then the shadow splits, two crowns, one drifting west toward Moscow, the other fading into smoke. The merging of empires, or the swallowing of one by another? The vision doesn't answer. You remember an odd tidbit, some 18th century European maps label, Great Tartary, across Siberia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, huge swaths of land, sometimes larger than Russia itself. Later maps? The name just vanishes, as if overnight, an entire realm was erased by cartographers' pens. Historians still argue whether this was simply a label for unknown lands, or whether it reflected something more, an actual political entity whose identity got scrubbed out once Moscow tightened its grip. The silence of the imagined throne room weighs on you. You find yourself whispering, "Who sat here?" The room doesn't answer, but you feel a chill. Maybe no one remembers because remembering would make too many modern crowns wobble. You back away from the dice, eyes still on the twin shadows of crowns lingering on the map's floor. One shadow solid, the other dissolving, one remembered, the other denied. You wonder how many rulers in our history books were really inheritors of thrones that once belonged to Tartaria. The thought sticks to you like cobwebs as you move on. Tartaria wasn't just about machines and markets, it was about power. And if power is anything, it's jealous. You drift from throne rooms and shadows into something that feels almost too polished, too glossy to be real. White domes gleam, arches rise in impossible symmetry, and white boulevards stretch before you as if drawn with a ruler on the world itself. At first you think you've stumbled into some forgotten capital of Tartaria, but then the banners and posters remind you, this is not an empire. It's an exhibition, a World's Fair. Imagine it, Chicago, 1893. Paris, 1900. St. Louis, 1904. Cities erupt in instant architecture, vast marble halls, glittering domes, and whole, temporary, palaces built in a single season. The first dazzled millions, showcasing electricity, automobiles, telegraphs, even the Ferris wheel. Mainstream history says these were celebrations of human progress, evidence that the modern age had arrived. But fringe whispers suggest something different. What if many of those buildings weren't built but uncovered? You stroll through the white city of Chicago's fair, glowing with electric lights strung across facades. The air smells of popcorn and machine oil. Kids gawk at the moving walkway. The world's first, but your gaze lingers on the architecture, massive Greco-Roman columns, domes like St. Peter, siglo, intricate fountains spraying water in perfect arcs. All this, supposedly temporary, built in just a couple of years with plaster and lath. You raise an eyebrow, really? They slapped all this together like a weekend home renovation project? Historians still argue whether the scale of those expositions was feasible with the time and resources recorded. Some insist the first were indeed miracles of organization and manpower. Others mutter that it looks suspiciously like someone repurposed structures already standing, ruins or remnants of an older civilization, and then tore them down after the fair so no one would ask too many questions. Here's your quirky tidbit. The Chicago World's Fair included a massive, electricity building, filled with light bulbs and motors. At a time when most Americans' homes were still dark after sunset. Guests wandered inside to see machines that seemed almost magical. Some fringe theorists joke that the building itself might have been wired into Tartarian-style wireless energy grids, humming away in plain sight. Imagine flipping on your iPhone charger in 1893 and nobody bats an eye. You chuckle softly at the thought of some Victorian fairgoer saying, "Yes, my dear, the building seems to power itself. Quite normal." Meanwhile, their horse-drawn carriage waits outside. Paris in 1900 takes it even further. You picture the Exposition Universelle, with its moving sidewalks, electric taxis, and the Eiffel Tower looming overhead like a needle threading the sky. Whole pavilions sparkled with designs that would look futuristic even today. Were these just ambitious architects flexing their muscles, or leftovers of something older, dressed up for the occasion? The eerie part is what happened after. Many of these palaces of plaster were demolished almost immediately. Historians explain that plaster wasn't meant to last. These were temporary wonders, not permanent landmarks. But in your dreamlike stroll, you can't help but smirk. Yeah, sure, they just tore down entire palaces like a kid kicking over a sand castle. Because, what? Storage space? The explanation feels thinner than the plaster it lands on. You linger before a photo in your imagination, black and white, grainy, but undeniable. A crowd of fairgoers in bowler hats and long dresses, standing in front of structures so vast and ornate they could rival Rome. And you wonder, if Tartaria really had advanced architecture, if its cities were buried or erased, wouldn't this be exactly how you'd hide them? Present them as temporary fairgrounds. Dazzle the public for a season. Then bulldoze the evidence. A whisper crosses your mind. Maybe the first weren't just entertainment. Maybe they were tests. Imagine governments quietly experimenting with technology pulled from Tartarian ruins, wireless lighting, power transmission, even moving sidewalks. Show it off. See how people react. Then tuck it away again until the timing feels right. You tilt your head back, staring up at one of those domes in your dream. Its surface gleams, flawless, almost alive in the night light. For a moment you think you hear it humming, like a generator idling. The fairgoers around you don't seem to notice. They sip lemonade and marvel at the Ferris wheel while a forgotten technology buzzes over their heads. And then, just like that, the vision dims. You hear the demolition crews moving in. Sledgehammers, dust clouds, entire, temporary, cities reduced to rubble. Except the streets still remember. And somewhere, tucked in a warehouse, maybe a machine from those halls still hums quietly, waiting. You sigh. The world's fairs were supposed to show the best of humanity. Maybe they did. Or maybe they were Tartaria's last costume party before the curtain dropped forever. You shuffle forward, leaving the rubble of world fairs behind, and stumble into a plaza that smells of rust and dust. It's quieter here, like a forgotten scrapyard at the edge of time, half buried in the weeds. You see shapes, hulking silhouettes of iron wheels, gears the size of dinner tables, pipes twisted like giant spaghetti, machines that shouldn't exist in the centuries where they're found. Take the Antikythera mechanism, For example, a small bronze contraption pulled from the sea near Greece. Dated to around 100 BCE, historians agree it functioned as an astronomical computer, predicting eclipses and planetary positions. A mainstream fact, plain as day, the Greeks had more technical skill than we often give them credit for. But in the hush of this dreamlike scrapyard, you can't help but grin, if they had pocket calculators 2000 years ago. What else slipped through the cracks? Now shift your gaze eastward, into Tartarian rumors. Fringe accounts whisper of forgotten engines in Siberia, places where explorers stumbled on gears and pistons fossilized in rock. One quirky tale from the 20th century describes miners digging deep and finding a wheel embedded in coal seams millions of years old. Mainstream scientists roll their eyes. Suggesting natural formations can mimic mechanical patterns. But you squint at that rusty wheel and mutter, yeah, right, nature just decided to cosplay as a steampunk machinist. Historians still argue whether early industrial advance popped up spontaneously in multiple places or if knowledge traveled far wider than we admit. The official story is that the Industrial Revolution bloomed in Europe, powered by coal, steam, and clever inventors, yet the machines in your scrapyard feel older, or maybe recycled from something earlier. Something Tartarian. You run your fingers along a corroded cylinder. It almost hums beneath your touch, like it's waiting to spin back to life. For a second, you imagine these were wireless engines, machines designed not to batch smoke, but to draw power from the ether, tapping into atmospheric electricity through those towers we whispered about earlier. Picture steam engines without the steam, locomotives without the coal. If you could ride one, it might boom softly like a Tesla car. Centuries too soon. Speaking of Tesla, Nikola, not the one that sells overpriced electric SUVs. You recall how in 1895 he unveiled his plans for wireless energy. Lighting bulbs without wires, transmitting power through the air. Historians acknowledge that Tesla was a genius, maybe even ahead of his time. But some Tartaria believers insist he wasn't ahead, he was rediscovering. Maybe those forgotten engines in the scrapyard are what he was dreaming toward. Echoes of a system that once spanned continents. Here's your odd tidbit. In the 1800 siglo, inventors filed patents for bizarre contraptions that sound suspiciously futuristic, mechanical birds, perpetual motion devices, even aerial ships, resembling modern drones. Most never worked, or so the record says. Yet in your twilight stroll, you picture them actually buzzing across the sky, only to vanish into locked vaults and dusty patent archives. You pause at a particularly massive shape in the junkyard. It's a wheel taller than you, rimmed with teeth like a saw. Your imagination fills in the missing pieces, a factory. Perhaps, powered by rivers of invisible energy, churning out glass that doesn't shatter, steel that bends like clay. Then the factory fell silent. Maybe it was a war, maybe a flood, or maybe somebody just decided history needed to be simpler. Tidier, less confusing for school children. The silence deepens. A crow lands on a twisted rod, its black feathers glinting in the dim light. It caws once, like it's mocking your wide-eyed wonder. Forgotten engines, you whisper. Machines that might have carried people across continents without smoke. Machines that could have changed the way you live now. Instead, you plug your phone into the wall like a caveman with fire. Still, you can't shake the suspicion, buried beneath mud and rubble. Perhaps in some locked museum basement. A few of these relics wait. Their gears may be rusted, their pistons hammered, but their secrets remain. And if Tartaria was real, those secrets weren't lost, they were hidden. The scrapyard fades as you walk on. The echo of gears clanking softly behind you, like lullabies from machines that no longer exist. The air cools around you as your footsteps crunch over frost. The scrapyard of gears dissolves. And now you find yourself trekking across a Siberian expanse so wide it feels endless. The ground is frozen solid. The wind bites your cheeks. And the horizon is painted in pale blues and whites. You're trudging through the kind of place where you could scream at the top of your lungs. And nobody would ever hear you. Siberia, the graveyard of secrets. A mainstream fact to ensure yourself. Siberia is home to Pacific burial mounds. Ancient tombs filled with mummified Scythians. Complete with intricate tattoos and preserved textiles dating back to the 5th century BCE. Archaeologists uncovered felt carpets, golden ornaments, and even a chariot. So yes, this land has always held mysteries beneath its permafrost. But you can't help thinking, it also feels like a convenient freezer. A place that could preserve traces of an empire time itself tried to erase. Here's where it gets quirky. Travelers and locals sometimes whisper about odd ruins, chunks of stone shaped too neatly, too purposefully, to be natural. In the frozen taiga, people have claimed to stumble upon towering blocks stacked like forgotten fortresses, or smooth slabs carved with spirals no glacier should have edged. One rumor tells of a metal wall buried in the tundra, stretching for miles like the remains of a lost citadel. Scientists tend to shrug it off, suggesting glacial fractures or natural iron deposits. You raise an eyebrow and think, sure, because glaciers always build themselves in straight lines. Historians still argue whether steppe civilizations spread advanced architecture far into these ice regions or if such reports are exaggerations fueled by frostbite delirium. The debate is left dangling. As always, you press onward, the crunch of snow beneath your boots keeping time. You stumble across the infamous Valley of Death, in Yakutia, Real Place. By the way, locals whisper of giant metallic cauldrons half buried in the earth, structures that supposedly kill anyone who lingers nearby too long. The mainstream dismisses them as folklore, warning tales to keep kids from wandering into dangerous swamps. But you crouch at the edge of a frozen pit, half expecting to see the curved lip of a massive iron dome gleaming through the ice. Your breath curls in the frigid air, and you mutter, if that's not Tartaria's kitchenware, I don't know what is. The silence out here feels heavier than any city you've imagined so far. No chatter, no music, just the wind whistling through broken pines. Yet in that silence, your mind fills with visions, caravans of Tartarian traders crossing this endless steppe, hauling fabrics lighter than silk and engines small enough to carry on sledges. Maybe they had heating towers powered by that wireless energy, warm spheres of protection glowing in the blizzards. And maybe, when the collapse came, those towers failed, and the steppe reclaimed everything with ice. You glance up and notice stars peppering the sky. Out here, without city lights, they burn brighter, sharper. The constellations look ancient, almost too precise. You imagine Tartarian astronomers setting up observatories in these plains. Their instruments built from those forgotten engines you just left behind. You picture them tracking comets, predicting eclipses, whispering warnings about cycles of catastrophe. Perhaps they saw the mud flood coming, the way others might glance at a weather forecast. But knowledge doesn't always save you. Sometimes it only makes the ending more dramatic. You pass a small village, a scattering of wooden houses, smoke curling from chimneys. The people inside live simple lives, raising reindeer, cutting wood, fishing under the ice. Yet one old man swears to you that his grandfather told stories about giants who once strode across the steppe, building towers of metal and stone. Smiles with a few missing teeth, as if to say, you won't believe me anyway. The night deepens. Your boots grow heavier. The frost bites deeper into your skin. But something about this endless expanse feels like a riddle wrapped in snow. Tartaria, if it existed, left no obvious monuments like the pyramids or the Great Wall. Instead, it may have left whispers hidden in ice, ruins swallowed by permafrost, stories buried in villages where electricity only arrived a few decades ago. You tilt your head and think, maybe that's the cleverest hiding place of all. Your breath fogs in the frozen air as you leave behind the Siberian hush. The wind softens, and suddenly you're not trudging anymore, you're listening. Listening to whispers, not the playful kind, but the heavy kind, the kind that weigh down like bricks. They tell of pages ripped, names erased, maps redrawn. If Tartaria was real, it didn't just fall apart, it was buried under something colder than Siberia. Deliberate silence. You pause on the edge of memory, imagining libraries whose shelves were once stacked with books describing Tartarian wonders. Mainstream history gives you the familiar anchor. The Russian Empire expanded eastward, swallowing Siberia and Central Asia between the 16 and 19 centuries. Maps redrew themselves under Tsarist ambitions. Cities renamed, borders shifted. Official history says that's just how empires grow. Yet, as you hold that fact in your mind, the whispers tug at your sleeve. What if those expansions weren't mere conquests, but cover-ups? What if the new rulers erased what stood before? A quirky tidbit clings here. Conspiracy buffs point to photographs of orphan trains in the 19th century, crowds of children shipped across continents. Faces blank with confusion. The official story says these were homeless kids relocated to new families. The whispering version suggests otherwise, that these were Tartarian children, displaced after their civilization was dismantled, scattered so they'd forget their origins. You rub your temples, thinking, wow, history's worst rebranding campaign, erase the parents, rewrite the kids. Historians still argue whether 19th century Imperial Russia had a coordinated strategy of cultural erasure, or if local traditions simply vanished under the steamroller of modernization. The debate never closes, and maybe it never will, because absence of evidence can look suspiciously like evidence of absence. You imagine a fire, not the warm hearth kind, but the kind that devors parchment and scroll. Entire archives, burnt under the excuse of too fragile, too irrelevant, too redundant. You see men in long coats feeding documents into flames, while scribes rewrite the past in neat Cyrillic. Outside, the mud floods might have buried buildings. Inside, fire buried memory. And then there are the photographs, sepia-toned cityscapes of the late 1800 siglo showing massive stone buildings allegedly built in just a few short years. The World's Fair, the shining palaces, the monumental arches. The official captions say, temporary plaster. But when you squint at those photos, you feel the whispers again. Why build temporary structures with that much detail? Why demolish something so beautiful? Maybe the erasure wasn't only ink and paper, it was sledgehammers and dynamite. You walk through a ghostly archive now. Rows of shelves stretching into the darkness. You pull a book down and open it. But half the pages are missing. Sliced clean. The remaining text describes a war, vague, brutal, unamad. The Tartarians, if they existed, weren't just erased by time, they were targeted. A war of erasure. You close the book and slide it back, whispering to yourself, history isn't written by the victors. It's deleted by them. The weight of it presses down on your shoulders. Imagine being a scholar in the 1700s who stumbled across a Tartarian relic, an engine, a manuscript, a tower still humming faintly with energy. Do you publish it and risk your career? Or do you quietly bury it so no one asks the wrong questions? Maybe that's why we're left with whispers. Too many people chose silence. You recall the mud flood again, the theory that cities were deliberately buried. Not just by disaster, but by shovels and scaffolds afterward. That the erasure was twofold, the ground swallowed the architecture, and the new powers swallowed the narrative. You chuckle under your breath. Who knew mud could moonlight as a hitman? A faint light glimmers ahead, an old printing press. Gears still sticky with ink. You lean in and see pamphlets rolling off. Rewritten histories hot from the press. Every pamphlet tells you what you're supposed to believe. Tartaria? Never heard of her. Must be folklore, myth, a fever dream. And you stand there, knowing this, erasure isn't just subtraction. It's replacement. To forget Tartaria. They didn't just burn the past, they wrote something new in its place. Cleaner, safer, easier to control. The whispers fade, but the echo lingers in your chest. A civilization's greatest enemy isn't time or nature, it's being deliberately forgotten. Oh blink, and daylight slants across the stone. Not crumbling ruins this time. Not half-buried relics. But real, living architecture. You're walking through a modern city. The kind you could visit tomorrow with a cheap plane ticket. Yet your eyes keep snagging on details. Arches too tall. Domes too smooth. Facades so precise they almost sneer at the idea of hand chisels. Mainstream fact holds steady. Neoclassical architecture boomed in the 18 and 19 centuries. Columns, domes, grand public buildings meant to echo the glory of Greece and Rome. You can see it in Washington, D.C., Paris, London, St. Petersburg. But as your gaze lingers on these massive stone structures, another thought wriggles in. Are we really looking at copies of ancient styles? Or leftovers of something older, maybe Tartarian? A quirky tidbit tickles you here. Some enthusiasts argue that the Capitol buildings across the world aren't just coincidentally similar, but were once a part of a unified architectural system. Till point at the domes of St. Paul's Cathedral, the U.S. Capitol, and even remote city halls. Saying, look, the same template. Different continents. You imagine a global architectural IKEA catalog, one empire kit. Dome included. Historians still argue whether architectural similarities across empires show cultural borrowing, global trade, or something deeper. Maybe it was just fashion, Europeans loving colognes the way TikTok loves dances. Or maybe, just maybe, those similarities hint at a forgotten parent style, one that predates neoclassicism entirely. Your footsteps echo in an empty train station now. The ceiling arches impossibly high. Light pouring through windows like honey. A station built in the late 1800 siglo they say. Yet the walls look centuries older. The engineering suspiciously perfect. You chuckle softly. They claim it took 5 years to build. But it can't even fix my sink in 5 months. Then there are star forts. You see them from above. Geometric masterpieces. Perfect angles forming shapes too precise for casual military design. They dot Europe, Asia, even the Americas. Officially, tiered early modern fortresses. Designed to withstand cannon fire. But the whispering thought intrudes. Maybe they weren't forts at all. Maybe they were energy hubs. Nodes in a network Tartaria once used. Use Mirk, either defense against invaders, or medieval Wi-Fi routers. In the streets, you run your hands along stone blocks stacked so neatly they make modern concrete look sloppy. Entire government buildings labeled as temporary exhibition halls still stand today. Over a century later, their details crisp as fresh carvings. It makes you wonder, why call something temporary if it outlasts your grandma's lifespan? The debate rises again in your mind. Historians will say, we have blueprints, construction records, photos, and they do. But then you glance at those same records and notice how construction timelines feel absurdly short. Like entire palaces supposedly raised in just a couple of years. You shrug, unless they had Red Bull and 1,000 cranes. I'm not buying it. You picture walking past one of these neoclassical giants on your commute, let's say a courthouse. Or a bank. You grab a coffee, check your phone, barely glance at the columns. And yet, those columns might be older than you think. Hiding in plain sight. Architecture that isn't revival but survival. You recall the whispers of erasure from before. If Tartaria was deleted from the books, maybe its buildings couldn't be deleted so easily. It'd just be relabeled, repurposed, swallowed by the everyday. It's a clever trick. The best way to hide something extraordinary is to make it ordinary. Your gaze drifts upward, tracing a dome against the twilight. The stone catches the fading sun, glowing like embers. You breathe out slowly, realizing this, maybe Tartaria isn't gone. Maybe you've been walking through it your whole life, mistaking its skeleton for wallpaper. The city hums softly around you. Cars pass, neon signs flicker, and yet beneath all that noise, the stone holds secrets. Secrets that were never fully erased, only disguised. And as you keep walking, you can't unsee it anymore. Every building looks like a survivor. Every column feels like a question. Word count, 1082. Awaiting, continue. Download as audio. You said, continue. ChatGPT said, section 15. The city fades behind you like a mirage. The pavement softens into grass. The streetlights blink into stars. And suddenly you're standing on an endless steppe. The air is cold and wide. And silence spreads like a blanket. You realize that Tartaria, whatever it was, whatever it wasn't, has slipped into dream territory now. Your footsteps barely crunch. Ahead, you see faint shapes. Towers have sunk into the earth. Walls bent by time. Outlines of domes shimmering like smoke. But the harder you stare, the more they dissolve. Tear memories, not monuments. Tear questions dressed as stone. Mainstream fact whispers in. Civilizations rise and fall. From Sumeria to Rome to the Mayans. And everyone leaves behind ruins. That's what history says. We can track them, categorize them, measure their collapse. But Tartaria refuses to play by those rules. It leaves hints. Not ruins. It leaves puzzles, not timelines. The quirky side nudges you again. Some believers swear the proof hides in old family albums. In photos of distant relatives posing before, newly built, buildings that look ancient. Already worn. Till say those were Tartarian backdrops. Too big to demolish. Too mysterious to explain. So the official story was pasted over them like wallpaper. You grin at the thought. Grandpa wasn't just stiff in those photos. He was probably confused why the courthouse looked like Atlantis. Historians still argue whether we're just seeing patterns because our brains crave them. Or if suppressed history really lingers between the cracks. Maybe we're staring at coincidence stacked on coincidence. Or maybe the greatest empire never erased isn't a ghost at all, it's us. Squinting at the past and calling it lost. You sit down on the grass. The stars tilt overhead, dizzying in their number. The land feels ancient, as if it remembers more than you ever could. You imagine Tartaria not as a place, but as an idea, that history isn't finished. That we might have missed something vast. That maybe, just maybe, the story you've been told is only half the book. And in that quiet moment, you let it go, not erased, not proved, not solved, just let it drift. Tartaria belongs to that twilight place between fact and dream, where your mind wanders when sleep presses in. You exhale, shoulders softening, the world dimming. Because the truth is, Tartaria's most powerful gift isn't its towers or maps or theories. It's the way it makes you wonder. The way it nudges you to question, to imagine, to let your thoughts drift past the safe edges of the history textbook. The stars seem closer now. The grass breathes beneath you. You lie back, eyes half-lidded, and the steppe becomes your pillow. And as you sink, the last thought flickers through you. Maybe Tartaria was never meant to be found. Maybe it was meant to be dreamed. Now the steppe grows softer, the air heavier with calm. Your breathing slows as the sky above you deepens. Stars melting into a steady blur. Each one flickers like a lantern far away, reminding you how wide the universe is, and how small the day's worries really are. The grass beneath you is cool and steady, a cushion that holds you without question. The towers, the ruins, the debates, they fade into background whispers. Just another lullaby in the night. What remains is this gentle stillness, this weightless space between waking and sleep. Your eyes relax, every blink grows slower, heavier. The questions about Tartaria no longer need answers tonight. They can wait. For now, all you need is this drifting sensation. Like a boat rocking on the calmest sea. The of the world softens. The rhythm of your heart finds an easy pace. Like footsteps slowing at the end of a long walk. The mystery folds itself away, leaving nothing sharp, nothing heavy, only smooth edges. Only a soft hush. And as your body loosens, each limb sinking deeper into the quiet, your mind releases its grip. The story unspools into mist. The steppe stretches out into dream. You are safe here. You are warm here. You are allowed to let go. So drift now, gently, into the dark. Let Tartaria's smoke fade into stars. Let its whispers fade into silence. And let yourself fade into sleep. Good night.